like to begin with a couple of lines from Bob Dylan. The lines were obscure in 1965, and they remain obscure today, 50 years later. But somehow they seem to capture something about my talk at the end of this really quite extraordinary conference. Today, the internet is ubiquitous, as we know. We don't think much of it. Certainly, if you're under 30, it has always been there somewhere in your life. For many people, however, there was a life before the internet. I can remember that life, sometimes vividly, sometimes vaguely. Indeed, I can also recall a life before personal computing, a life where computing meant large mainframes, men and women in white coats, and air-conditioned rooms, and rather forbidding programming languages such as Fortran 2, which I learned in 1967, Summer of Love. In the autumn of 1992, 6 years after acquiring a BBC Micro and then an Amstrad PC, I finally joined the net, courtesy of Demon Internet. This wasn't my first taste of going online, as this had happened 4 years earlier when I signed up with CompuServe for email. However, very soon it became abundantly clear that access to the internet proper was going to be a very big thing. Demon wasn't, in fact, the first ISP in the UK. That honour goes to Pipex, but it was the first to offer online connectivity at a sensible subscription rate. Those early months were, I recall, quite exciting in a geekish sort of way, as one struggled to navigate and make sense of the various resources on the net. The World Wide Web had at that stage been invented, but it wasn't until 1993 that the Mosaic browser made it a really winning reality. And the rest, as they say, is history. There are many ways of looking at the growth of the internet as distinct from the growth in computing. However, one of the best ways is to look at the growth of nodes. This is what the picture looked like in 1969. As you can see, there are only 4 nodes in operation on the west coast of America: UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. Now let's fast forward to 2014 and to this almost galactic pattern of domains ranked according to traffic. The big blue blobs in the center represent Google and Facebook and YouTube, obvious suspects, and the yellow ones in the bottom represent the major Chinese domains, such as Baidu. In 1992, there were just 10 websites. A year later, 130, including my own, and this year, sometime, the figure is set to exceed 1 billion. That's the internet as we know it now. Already it's gone through various distinct phases, from static to dynamic content in websites, e-commerce, blogging, social networking, media streaming, etc., etc. And of course, at every stage of the process, it is the new emerging technologies that have acted as the real drivers, with Me Too always in train. The revolution, however, has just started, for we are now entering a significantly new phase in which all manner of devices and sensors are going to get connected. This is the definition of the term hammered out in Wikipedia. I won't read it, I'll let you read it. According to the networking giant Cisco, the Internet of Everything is not synonymous, though, with the Internet of Things. This is their schema, since the Internet of Things is actually subsumed within it. Indeed, you might describe it, perhaps not helpfully, as an intranet. According to Cisco, the Internet of Everything is about bringing together people, process, data, and things to make networked connections more relevant and valuable than ever before, turning information into actions that create new capabilities, richer experiences. Such a vision and the ambition that goes with it is both overarching and unlimited. In a panel discussion webcast from Davos, Switzerland in January this year, Eric Schmidt, executive chairman of Google, went even further by predicting that the internet as we currently know it will simply disappear. There'll be so many IP addresses, so many devices, sensors, things that you're wearing, things that you are interacting with, that you won't even sense it. It will be part of your presence all the time. Imagine you walk into a room and the room is dynamic. Superficially, such utopian counts of cyberspatial connectivity seem bold and compelling and encompass the prospect of advanced, especially when they encompass the prospect of advanced expert systems and robotics, quantum computing and artificial intelligence. However, to understand connectivity primarily through the paradigm of interactive control is, I would argue, problematic in its naive instrumentalism and implicit dualism. Eric Schmidt is probably correct in thinking that the internet as we know it will simply cease to exist in terms of our awareness of it. However, we need to ask the question of whether such cyberspatial connectivity, which brings together people and things through data and process, will actually enhance our experience of the world. On the one hand, it could be great fun and offer us a limitless cat's cradle of new possibilities. On the other hand, it could lead to a progressive loss of privacy and selfhood as we become immersed in a world which is ultimately controlled not by us, but by others. Let's consider first the optimistic take on the future. According to David Rose, an instructor in MIT, wearing your fashionable heads-up display, you will instruct the device to display the people's names and key biographical info above their heads. In the business meeting, you will call up information about previous meetings and agenda items. The HUD display will call up useful websites, tap into social networks, and dig into massive info sources. You will fact check your friends and colleagues. You'll also engage in real-time messaging, video conferencing with friends or colleagues who will participate, coach, consult, or lurk. Similarly, Rose envisions an enchanted wall in your kitchen that could display through lines of coloured light the trends and patterns of your loved one's moods, which will offer, in quotes, a better understanding of the hidden thoughts and emotions that are relevant to us. Now let us consider its converse. According to the technology writer Sue Halpern, as human behaviour is tracked and merchandised on a massive scale, the Internet of Things creates the perfect conditions to bolster and expand the surveillance state. In the world of the Internet of Things, your car, your heating system, your refrigerator, your fitness apps, your credit card, your television set, your window shade, your scale, your medications, your camera, your heart rate monitor, your electric toothbrush, and your washing machine, to say nothing of your phone, generate a continuous stream of data that resides largely out of reach of the individual, but not out of those willing to pay for it, or in other ways, commandeer it. To some extent, this dystopian view of the role of computing is a perennial one, and certainly predates the Internet of Things. In his BBC Two series, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, Adam Curtis, for example, argued that computers have not only failed to liberate humanity from drudgery, but have actually distorted and simplified our view of the world around us. The emerging Internet of Everything will, however, not only be all-pervasive, but also limitlessly immersive, where the boundaries between ourselves and our environment will become increasingly blurred. Interestingly, some early commentators of Internet culture made specific reference to the hallucinogenic quality of online activity. In 1995, for example, Dan Gwynn and John Alexander wrote in their snappily entitled essay, The Coming of Cyberspace Time and the End of Polity. The cardinal points and life's materiality disappear into the weightlessness of cyberspace time. One initially experiences a bodiless exaltation that may shortly settle into the armature of addiction. Going online flatlines a person. That is, it immobilizes the body and suspends normal everyday consciousness. One remains at once wholly engaged in and yet set apart from the informational nexus. Cyberspace time technologically extends and partly replaces everyday consciousness. As with drugs, we can speak of going into an altered state, experience eddies of need, frustration, and gratification, while we immerse ourselves in cyberspace time, physical limitations and boundaries collapse or disappear. In the Internet of Everything, however, elected cybernautic activity will be replaced by total immersion in an environment whose progressive artificiality poses serious challenges, I believe, to what might be crudely described as the complex somatic constitution of our consciousness. In particular, the melding of robotics and quantum computing will transcend narrow definitions of artificial intelligence, as epitomized in the classic Turing test, and usher in what the futurologist Ray Kurzweil has described as the singularity. In this new era or epoch, the Internet of Everything will essentially be the nowhere/everywhere place where web-extended minds tangle with human extended machine cognition. In such an environment, our normal understanding of what it means to know something as true, as certain, will be enormously strained, as we effectively relinquish any real ownership of that knowledge. Increasingly, our claims to knowledge will not arise from a consciousness which is rooted in our physical constitution, in short, in our bodies, in our bodies. This particular subject has, of course, been explored quite extensively in science fiction, but perhaps no more eloquently than Andrei Tarkovsky's 1972 adaptation of Stanislav's novel Solaris. In the film, Tarkovsky eschews the high-gloss cinematographic wizardry and pretentious Nietzschean themes of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, The Ultimate Trip, for a haunting exploration, courtesy of a leisurely narrative and wistful aesthetics, of what it means or could mean to be human. In particular, the film majors on the role of memory in establishing personal identity, while also posing the intriguing and inescapable question as to whether communication with others can ever be completely unambiguous or wholly authentic. The experience of enhanced connectedness, where the boundaries between the senses, the environment, and one's understanding of self, curated in time, blur and collapse, are, of course, one of the strongest characteristics of the psychedelic experience. However, entheogens, unlike the emerging Internet of Everything, offer an experience of being connected in a way which is both limited and personal. It is limited in the sense that even the longest trip is less than a day long, even if the experience itself gives rise to a lifetime of reflection. And it is personal in the sense that the experience belongs solely to me and has not been engineered or contrived despite its pharmacological basis. The other significant characteristic of the psychedelic consciousness is paradoxicality, the ability to experience things simultaneously in polarized or highly differentiated ways. One of the most eloquent descriptions of this is provided by the Welsh philosopher H.H. Price. The relevant paper was originally published by the American Society for Psychical Research in 1964 and refers to an experiment with mescaline in July 1952, an experiment which took place some 9 months before the more famous one described by Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception. Price's account is particularly interesting, I believe, because of his philosophical interest in perception and his considerable knowledge of art history. Here is the description of coming down on mescaline. I'll quote it in length. But before this gradual return to normality was finished, something happened which would have been enough by itself to make this day a most memorable one, at least to a philosopher. It was a visual hallucination, by far the best I ever had. Strictly speaking, it was a partial hallucination, since it affected only a part of the visual field, and the rest of the visual field remained perfectly normal. It happened rather late in the day. I was sitting on a chair looking at a divan bed. The bedspread covering had a very well-marked pattern, with strong contrast between the lighter parts and the darker parts. Quite suddenly, the bedspread appeared to turn into a pile of very large dead leaves. They were curious leaves, like holly leaves in shape, but very much larger, perhaps 3 times as large. They had the slightly crinkled shape which real holly leaves have, and they also had spikes on them, as real holly leaves do, but larger ones proportioned to the size of the leaves themselves. The colours were no longer the characteristic mescaline colours. They were pretty much what one would expect if one saw a real pile of dead holly leaves, except that the illumination appeared rather brighter than it physically ought to have been at that time of day. The shapes of the leaves were very clear and vivid. The whole pile and each leaf in it was markedly three-dimensional, if anything more solid-looking than a real pile of dead leaves would have been. Unlike the occasional minor visual hallucinations which most of us have probably experienced at some time or another, this one was not brief and fugitive. On the contrary, it continued for quite a long time, 2 or 3 minutes perhaps, without any noticeable change. My judgment was not in the least confused. I did not suppose for a moment that the leaves were really there, that they looked as real as could be. I was perfectly well aware all the time that the experience was hallucinatory, and greatly delighted by it just for that reason. This description prized both honours and delights in the vividness, the authenticity of his experience, while at the same time maintain a critical attitude towards it. The fact that he can do both points to the fact that certain knowledge is always a lived or inhabited experience. Classic psychedelic drugs are, I would argue, interesting because they provide individuals with the capacity to experience in a particularly intense way the sheer complexity of the process or processes by which the world becomes known to us. Clearly, behavioural psychology, linguistics, and neuroscience have significant roles to play in understanding their effects, but so too does philosophy. In the so-called Second Canteen Revolution, a term coined by Ross Mandel in 1978, attention shifts away from the products of knowing to its procedures. In his later writings, Wittgenstein, for example, shies away from cognitivism on the one hand and pure behaviourism on the other. Instead, he seems to advocate faith in action, in which certainty is interpreted attitudinally. In his notes on certainty, he writes of the latter as something that lies beyond being justified or unjustified, as it were, as something animal. Propositions are not simply projections of reality, nor even conjectures about reality. They are themselves a constitutive part of reality. For this reason, to understand the way in which a proposition is able to embody sense requires not only a fundamental insight into the actual function of language, but also some kind of ontological appraisal of linguistic enterprise in general. The idea that the real world is a world of depth, shade, and detail stands at the heart of Wittgenstein's revised philosophical thought on the relationship between language and reality. Certainly, it's not by pure chance that the inadequacy of the Tractatus first became evident in connection with the colour exclusion problem. And the last writings of Wittgenstein were concerned not only with certainty, but also with colour. In his remarks on colour, Wittgenstein insists on the inescapable complexity of all talk about colour, emphasising repeatedly that language about colour in no way admits any simple a priori analysis, but can only be understood contextually. Knowledge for Heidegger is never a mere relationship between subject and object. Rather, it is a primordial understanding of what there is with me, constituting my being in the world. Such understanding issues in the first instance from a fundamental state of mind, mood, or attitude, which discloses my being in the world as a whole and enables me, consequently, to interpret the world in a concernful or engaged way through particular practices. According to Roger Waterhouse, Heidegger's conception of understanding differs from the traditional concept of knowledge in 2 very important respects, namely that it is non-cumulative and non-transmittable. The former writes, understanding is non-cumulative because there is no more of it present after articulation than there was before. Similarly, understanding cannot really be transmitted from one person to another. All I can do is to articulate my understanding, hope that you will find it an adequate articulation of yours. Merleau-Ponty makes explicit the tendency of Heidegger to view the body as a kind of existentiel. According to Merleau-Ponty, the body is the very mode, indeed the only mode, by which we can become certain about the world and about ourselves. The mistake of Descartes and a very fundamental mistake was to construct an epistemology having already assigned the body as an object, even if a somewhat curious object, within a world whose very spatiality and temporality had been determined in advance by the notions of universal time, space and universal time. Yet the notions of universal space and time are exactly that, and no more, notions. Certainly they do not in any way correspond in reality to how human subjects actually experience time and space. At a very early stage, Cartesian epistemology substitutes cognition for perception, the pure reflective ego for the pre-objective view of the world afforded by bodily existence. Human existence, because it is a bodily existence, is necessarily an ambiguous existence. Descartes, of course, denied such ambiguity by prematurely giving the body objectivity, albeit an uncertain objectivity, at the beginning of his Meditations. Merleau-Ponty, however, argues that our own view of being in the world is not in any sense objectively given, but is pre-objective. It is not objective because objectivity necessarily implies a space-time continuum in which an object can be decidedly and totally located. The body is not such an object because it cannot locate itself without residue outside itself. Merleau-Ponty writes, "We must therefore avoid saying that our body is in space or in time. Rather, it inhabits space and time." According to Michael Polanyi, personal knowledge cannot be strictly justified since it is impossible to specify exhaustively and hence precisely both the grounds of the knowing and the context in which the knowing takes place. In all real knowing, there is a genuine integration both of our awareness of that which is specific to the object of knowledge and the cultural background of the act of knowing. The real significance of Polanyi's account of tacit knowledge, with its fundamental distinction between subsidiary and focal awareness, is that he avoids equating objectivity with externality. Moreover, the structural kinship between knowing and doing means that the real world continually exceeds our capacity to articulate through pure analysis. Indeed, pure analysis can often lead to a lack or even destruction of understanding. As Polanyi neatly puts it, an unbridled lucidity can destroy our understanding of complex matters. Scrutinize closely the particulars of a comprehensive entity and their meanings effaced. Our conception of the entity is destroyed. The emerging Internet of Everything promises us a new paradigm of connectivity, but is ultimately predicated on a sophisticated form of Cartesianism, a virtual sleight of hand in which all manner of things are brought together, but not in a way which is personal or determinative. In this brave new world, push will always trump pull, with the individual always playing catch-up to the desire or the desires of others. Moreover, never before in human history has it become so easy to offer off-the-peg understandings of human consciousness, whether via virtual reality hardware such as the Oculus Rift, which can reproduce the superficial Alice in Wonderland effects of psychedelic consciousness, such as micropsia or macropsia, or large-scale modelling of neural networks where state-of-the-art supercomputers can simulate brain activity over a short period of time. Such skepticism shouldn't be understood as being in any sense anti-science. I, for one, am genuinely enthusiastic about the research efforts undertaken by the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Studies at the University of Sussex, say, or the joint initiative taken by the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology Graduate University and Forschungszentrum Jülich. However, I also take very seriously the various philosophical critiques of scientific hegemony. The truth is that there's a world of difference between modelling or simulating reality and experiencing the same as an actual perceived instantiation. It's my prediction that in the next few years, the utopian language about the Internet of Everything will become increasingly widespread and progressively more extreme. Something indeed will be happening to us, to re-invoke Dylan's lyric, but we won't have the right tools to detach ourselves from the flow and ask the hard questions. Entheogens, I believe, in this context, offer a way forward, not comprehensively or exclusively, inasmuch as they allow us to experience connectedness, not in a thin, hollow, engineered way, but in a profoundly rooted way where emotion and intuition play an enhanced, modulated role in establishing our certitudes. Thank you.